Okay, we are now live on YouTube.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the PAB meeting on January 14th. It's now 6:35, and we're going to go ahead and get started. Connor, would you be able to put the agenda up?
Everyone see the agenda all right?
I can only see half of the screen. I can see where it says headings, pages, results.
Is that better? Okay.
Yes.
Great.
Okay, did everybody receive the minutes?
I didn't send out the minutes. I
Yeah.
have them. That is my fault. I have them here. Let me get them up on my screen. I'm very sorry, everyone. I had to take care of a personal
Okay. It's okay.
matter.
Thank
I'm
you.
just getting my computer set up here. Here we go. Okay, so these are the meeting minutes from our last meeting. Where are they? Whole bunch of unanimous votes.
Okay, if everyone can take a minute to take a look at that.
Just gonna correct you. Okay, there we go.
Okay, I guess I would just ask if we need to write down the reason why we went into executive session here.
I think that's a good call, Dr. McIntosh. We'll do executive session.
I can never spell personnel.
Glad I've got a supporter here, Dr. Harvey. Thanks.
All right. If everyone has reviewed, I would just need a motion on the floor.
So move. Second.
Danielle's the second. Okay, hold on. So Harvey, I heard, was the first, and Danielle second. Okay. All in favor? Can I see a show of hands? Okay. Anyone opposed? Anyone abstain? Okay. Motion carried.
And I'll just say for folks watching, Ida Perez had to drop out for a second. She's having computer troubles, but she'll be back. So with that in place, I think we can move on to the next part of our agenda, which is a report from me, giving an update on everything that's happening. So first, I just want to say thanks to everyone who attended our meeting on Tuesday. We had a really fantastic group of folks turn out to hear about our recommendations. I've only received wonderful feedback from that. In addition to the 50 some odd people who joined us live, over about 100 people watched that on Facebook Live too. So we got really great response there. And so let me just pull up my little PowerPoint and we can get going. So quite a bit has happened even since Tuesday. And I want to make sure that both the board and the public is understanding what we are doing. So let me just hit the start here. Okay. So I'm going to discuss a few things. First, all the feedback that we've gotten from this working group process. I want to just give an overview of that feedback and how we've generated it. I'm going to talk about other groups' recommendations to the working group that we've heard already. I'm going to give a brief update on Wilmer Hale because the working group met with them this afternoon. And then I'm going to talk about the revised working group timeline based on everything that's happened over the last 48 hours. And then I'll briefly talk about oversight hearings and some updates regarding protests in Rochester. So first, just here's some figures and facts about our outreach and response. And we've gotten a lot of great media coverage on TV, radio, print, online, detailing what our recommendations are and the process for getting feedback. We've given over 10 presentations to different groups and individuals, from city council members to the public, to the Police Accountability Board Alliance, to groups like Shades of Sisterhood. It's been really wonderful, all those presentations. And thanks to all the board members who've taken time to give those presentations over the last couple of weeks. Over 200 people have attended or watched our presentations in total. Fantastic figure. And that's generated over 20 pages of single-spaced feedback. Now I'm going to wait to circulate all the feedback to the board until tomorrow, when the deadline for giving feedback is, in theory. I know we'll continue to get feedback after that, and I'll definitely update folks on what we hear from the public. And those 20 pages of single-spaced feedback include my summaries of voicemails, telephone calls, and personal conversations that I've had with people as well. I'm just going to summarize some of the themes from what we've already heard from folks. Oops, okay, let's go back. So first, one of the themes is people are a little concerned that some of the wording in our recommendations suggests that we are advocating for an expansion of the Rochester Police Department budget. And there was strong pushback from that from a lot of different quarters. You know, the idea that there should be an increase in funding for certain kinds of training, but that increase in funding should come from other parts of the RPD's existing budget rather than additional dollars from elsewhere. There was a lot of questions about the first responder model that we're pushing for. I just want to clarify, we're advocating for increased funding to whatever alternative first responder model the city is investing in. No matter what, that's the priority point. But there's just a lot of different feedback we've gotten about the first responder model. You know, what does the city's first responder model look like? Here's specific things that first responder model should do. This has probably been the place where we've gotten the most feedback, questions, and pushback. Not necessarily pushback, but critical thoughts. Another one is we've gotten a lot of feedback about evictions, and that there should be a new set of first responder models that include evictions. So, you know, RPD will show up to both legal evictions and illegal evictions. And there's been a lot of feedback we've received saying from both police officers and from civilians, saying that police officers should not be involved in the evictions process, or to have police officers be the secondary backup response, and that there should be a lawyer or a different city employee who shows up to evictions first. There's a lot of questions about implementation. You know, who's going to be implementing these recommendations? What role does the PAB have in making sure that all these recommendations get off the ground? But all that being said, in general, there's broad support for most recommendations. There's been a lot of praise for the data, and there's also been, I think, an understanding that without data, we can't know what a lot of the problems are, and the depth of those difficulties, problems, and the changes that need to happen. My biggest takeaway from all this feedback is that we need more time, data, and resources to build sustainable change. You know, we have spent so much time with this, and you could devote months to any one of these issues, figuring out what the right first responder model is, figuring out what specific pieces of data should be coming out of the RPD, figuring out, when officers should or should not be involved in certain kinds of policies or practices, whether it's traffic enforcement or evictions. And the point being is that all the feedback that we've received is really useful, and we should use it not just in this process, but in the future work we do if and when we approach any of these individual topics. And the only thing I'd say is that I think that we will revise our recommendations based on the feedback. There's been so much feedback about very, very small and specific things that has just been really, really great. Things like, this certain policing policy is a little different than the way you characterize it. So that kind of feedback, I think, is just going to be very simple and straightforward to adopt. But in a lot of these places, it's clear that there's so much community debate that needs to be had to figure out what the right thing is. And it's probably premature for us to make a clear recommendation. For example, with the alternative first responder model, it's going to take time to figure out, look at what's happened across the country and figure out what the right model is. And so I think to the extent that we can focus on, the recommendations we've already made, tweaking those, and then continuing to say, change will continue to happen in the future. And it's the Police Accountability Board that should be investigating anything that has to do with policy changes coming out of the RPD or shifting responsibilities from RPD to other parts of the system. I want to go to other group recommendations, but before I do, I didn't know if folks had questions about the feedback that we'd already received from the community. I can take a pause here if we want to talk about that.
I don't know, just looking at that, I know this is probably something for the future, but just thinking about this first responder model and how it works, just wanting to know at some point maybe we can get, everything typically goes through 911 dispatch, feedback from them as well in terms of how that process is, or if they have any specific questions. It would be good to get their kind of input as well. Just a thought.
I think that's completely right. Even if we were just thinking about the first responder model, we'd want to talk to people who've been part of the existing models, police officers, people who've been on the service end of those, the people who've have 311 or 911 called on them. We'd want people in the medical profession. We'd want outside experts from other communities. So you can see just on any one part of public safety or policing, we're going to need a lot of information, feedback, and time. And so, getting it right in the next 2 weeks is going to be really hard. I think it's going to be very, very hard. And so the more we can, think broader, the better.
Connor, it was my understanding, listening to the police explanation of the eviction model or problem, that they are required by law to do what they were doing. If so, then that's not a change that we need to make locally. That's a change that needs to be made higher up on the legal ladder, isn't it?
2 points on that. The RPD, like legal, the court order that said RPD, you have to do X, Y, and Z, that was happening in the context of a certain kind of eviction, a legally approved of eviction. RPD also has a model for dealing with what's called an illegal eviction. When a landlord has done a lockout and kicked someone out of their house when the person had a right to stick around. And in those situations, RPD has a model of bringing certain kinds of officers to the scene to manage that situation, to figure out, what's going on, landlord, you can't do X, Y, or Z. That's one place where RPD has created a model, and it is a choice. It is a choice for the city to do that. And so thinking about, should officers be the ones showing up in that situation, or should it be lawyers, social workers, whoever, to take the first crack at figuring out what's going on and, if the landlord needs to be ordered to do something, before having police come in. So I think that's one part of it. And the second part, Bob, is specifically to what, the kind of legal evictions process where there might be a court order saying, police, you just got to go do this. You got to, arrest some people, evict some people. I think that I watched that hearing too on the 6th. I think I'd like to hear more facts about what happened, the sequence, what the order was. I think there's just a lot more information I would need to just, give the sign off to RPD policy on that level. But I think you're right, Bob, is that if everything was kosher there, then you'd have to, take a step up to state law to figure out the police involvement in evictions.
Gotcha.
Ida?
Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Going back to the 911 calls, I agree with Dr. Celia, but I think also it would be good for us to help the community understand the process when people call 911. Because
Yes.
I often hear, people, I call and I don't know where my call goes and I don't know what happened and the police never came. And I think it's important for people to understand how those calls are prioritized and why, why you may have called and a police officer may not have come. And so I think it's important at some point if we can help educate the community on how the 911 process, when you call 911, what is the process and how those calls are prioritized. And then also, how do you, is it important for you to get the dispatcher's number? Those type of things, because a lot of times people don't know that.
And all I'll say on this is that it's our job to make the policing system transparent. So this is absolutely in our wheelhouse, and we are the ones that should be implementing that, making the community understand this whole system. And I'll say it's the same thing, Bob, with evictions. There's a lot of questions about who's supposed to do what and when. When it comes to police's involvement, we should be making it transparent. Any other feedback? Feedback on the feedback. Any other questions about the feedback section of this, or am I ready to move on? Reverend Harvey, I can't hear you. Are you giving me the go ahead? Okay, good. All right. So I'll move on to, the other group's recommendations. Because remember, it's not just PAB that's sitting at the table. It's RPD, the Race Commission, UCLM, and technically, Wilmer-Hale. So the Race Commission hasn't released its recommendations, but it's clear that they're going to be focusing on training, addressing officer training. That's going to be their big thing. So we haven't seen the details of what they're recommending, but we're going to find out. UCLM did release their recommendations last week. I know I already gave you the top line on that. I'm going to dive into a little more detail tonight, just so folks have a better understanding of what UCLM is recommending. RPD has, in a request, they told the Democrat and Chronicle that they will not release their recommendations until this reconciliation retreat. So essentially, on the day that all of the working group members are supposed to come together and draft a plan, that's when RPD will give us input. So I can't. We don't know what RPD's approach to this. Again, RPD has released data, is making findings about what's going on in the department. Listing all the programs it has, this kind of stuff, but no recommendations yet from RPD. And Wilmer-Hale has not released its recommendations, and I'm going to detail that in just a minute. But so the point is that it's us and UCLM that have made our recommendations public here. And I'm going to hop to UCLM so we can understand. I'm going to breeze through this, but their first recommendation is for a civilian-led officer interview panel. And the devil's in the details on this one. There's a pool of 15 civilian interviewers, and it gets narrowed down to 10 by UCLM themselves. So UCLM would choose who these civilians would be. Different community organizations would nominate people to be in the pool. And so any officer who was interviewing for a position in RPD, I believe it's transfer or new recruit, would have to be interviewed by the civilian panel. They'd be asked questions about officer stress, their attitudes towards policing, racism. They'd be specifically asked about George Floyd, Daniel Prude, and their approach to de-escalation. These are just proposed questions that UCLM would ask, but the point is, I think, to focus on officer beliefs and attitudes about race in the community. And that shouldn't be there, but yeah, so that's the civilian-led review panel or interview panel. And there's also the racial, this is their second recommendation, not the first, racial justice educational curriculum. It's the idea to have 20 hours of in-class and 20 hours of in-service training on racial justice. It would cover race, the curriculum covers racism, poverty, the history of RPD, and 21st century policing. This educational curriculum would be interactive and experiential, getting people out of their seats. It wouldn't just be, reading out of a book. It would be people interacting with each other and actors, this kind of stuff to understand racism and poverty. There would be post-training assessments to make sure that people were actually, learning instead of just going through the motions. But the curriculum itself is copyrighted by UCLM. And so UCLM is asking for their specific curriculum to be used in this process. The de-escalation training here has 5 different points. The key point is that UCLM wants the same amount of training on de-escalation as they do on use of force. So for every hour an officer gets trained to use a gun, punch, kick, whatever, they also have to have an hour on how to not use force, to de-escalate situations. They want de-escalation to become a core theme of officer training rather than something on the side. Again, it would be interactive and experiential with post-intervening training. And this thing about the duty to intervene, it's kind of wrapped up in the recommendation, but UCLM's asking for a duty to intervene in cases of excessive use of force. So essentially, an officer would be breaking the rules if they didn't step in when someone else was using too much force. The recommendation, the 4th recommendation they have is about a new body-worn camera policy. For the most part, UCLM's asking for a simple countywide system to make sure that all police and law enforcement officers are using body-worn cameras in the county. I need to learn a little more about the details to see how it would affect the RPD, but the core of their recommendation is broadening out what we kind of already have in the city. Their last recommendation is about pre-arrest diversion programs, taking models from places like Albany that train officers to better assess non-arrest situations. They want some kind of pilot program off the ground by the middle of this year, but they want it to be, again, a pilot program, something small in size. And again, the focus here is on training officers to think differently about how to or how not to arrest people. So those are Wilmer Hale's recommendations in a nutshell. I'll say that, from the highest level, a lot of them align with what we've already recommended, anti-racist training, having officers, do some more de-escalation. The citizen interview panel is not something that we had advocated for, but in the sense that it's more community control of who gets to be on the police force. That's something different. But what I'll say is that, these recommendations, UCLM has been working on these for a while, and they were not necessarily driven by this reform process in the same way that ours were. Rabbi Settle, I see that you have your hand raised, so if you'd like to say something.
Yeah, I just want to note that before you came on board, Dr. McIntosh had raised the possibility of civilian interviewing being part of PAB's task, and had brought in some models from other places where that happened. So I just want to flag that.
Yeah. And I'll say that, I've heard in community feedback forums pushback on UCLM being the organization in charge of that. General support for civilian interview, but questions about implementation. Any other questions about UCLM's recommendations?
Yeah, so I guess, oh, sorry, did I? Okay, so I guess a couple things. They already have their curriculum copywritten. I guess I would be wondering, that's probably further for the process, but we'd have to probably review that and vet that and see how that curriculum looks. And then I guess one of the things that I was wondering, in terms of this 20-hour training and in-service, did they mention how they wanted to evaluate that, how often that was going to be done? If an officer gets a complaint on them, 6 months into the job, or, or if you just get a complaint in general, are you going to be required to get an additional layer of training or in service? I'm just wondering if some of that was listed in their documentation. No?
I think it was at a very general level that training would be reinforced and assessed throughout an officer's career. I did not see an enforcement mechanism, discipline for officers who show that they aren't abiding by the training. But I don't want to promise that it's not in there, but I didn't read it when I didn't see it when I read through the documents a couple times.
Yeah, I would be interested if they're going to add an evaluation piece to that, to see if they're seeing improvement overall from implementing these strategies. I don't know who was next. Was it? There's 3 hands up. Go ahead, Bob, and then I'll get Ricky and then Rabbi.
By law, if things work out, we're supposed to be handling discipline. It's going to be really awkward if everything leading up to there is being run by somebody else.
Great point. Ricky, Dr. Harvey.
Okay, I read some of UCLM's works after our meeting, and it seems like we have some that we might be able to work together as a team in some areas, but I'm wondering how they feel about us when I look at this civilian piece that will do whatever this civilian board is doing that they were talking about. So I just kind of want to know a little bit more about that civilian review board versus PAB, and how do we reconcile who will do what?
I'm supposed to have a meeting with Reverend Stewart sometime in the next week. So if people have questions on this, I definitely can ask some of that.
It's okay if I can just sort of jump in and say, the one thing I would say too is that I would want to know that any curriculum or training has been, tested, that there's been some study of its results. I don't think that sort of our overhaul of the RPD is the place to do a beta testing, if you know what I mean. So that would be my concern too.
Sounds more like alpha testing, isn't it? But also, has anybody seen this copyrighted business?
I have not seen the copywritten curriculum. I have not seen the full curriculum, but I can obtain it from UCLM.
I wonder what they've put together.
Yeah, I'm very interested too.
Reverend Nickloff.
Speaking as someone who's got a foot in the clergy world, I'd also be doubly concerned about ensuring that as a group labeled the United Christian Leadership Ministries, they do amazing work. They've done amazing policy suggestions over the time. I have no reason to doubt this. But, even on this board, it's not all people from a Christian background or even from a religious background, and ensure that it represents people of Rochester, and that is something we just make sure continues to happen. It's strange to me, even though I'm a religious leader on this panel, that a explicitly religious group has given so much oversight in this instance. And again, they do great work, so it's not a question of their integrity, but I do believe that we need to be careful around that as well. As someone who's a religious leader, I think, we always have to be careful to ensure that we represent all of Rochester and not just those who we assume would go along with us, even if we have the best of intentions.
Good point. Any other feedback? Okay. Go ahead,
Okay.
Connor.
With that, I will head on to our next section, which is about Wilmer Hale. So today, the working group had its first meeting with WilmerHale. Now, people from WilmerHale have shown up to one working group meeting before. I believe it was back in either the beginning of December or late November. But that was mostly just a meet and greet to kind of meet the people. I think it was just before their contract was approved. So today was the first time that a subset of the working group has met with WilmerHale to check in. And this was the first time we actually discussed what they've been up to. And so, I think as I've said, Danielle Conley, who had initially been hired to run this, is no longer working on this because she is Deputy White House Counsel for Biden, for President-elect Biden. So instead it is John Walsh with, I believe, it's one counsel and I believe one associate as the kind of main team for WilmerHale. Just a reminder, the contract with WilmerHale has them investigating 4 areas of work: use of force, de-escalation, body-worn camera, and mental health response. And again, all these areas are with regards to RPD's policies and practices. So they're just focused on what the Rochester Police Department is doing in these 4 areas. Today they just announced that their draft recommendations are not ready. They're not ready to. They don't have written concrete set of recommendations yet. But that the RPD has improvements that they're needed around the edges. What WilmerHale will be recommending is not a fundamental overhaul of the department, but tweaks to various policies. And again, like they haven't firmed anything up yet. WilmerHale wanted to say that everything's tentative. They want to speak to people. They want feedback. They want it to be a process, etc. But this is kind of where they're at right now. And their process seems to have been reviewing all of the public policies and procedures. RPD has also given them access to all the training materials that RPD receives. WilmerHale has been given, the ability to interview and speak with, lots of different officers. I don't know how many. It could be as few as 4. It could be as many as, dozens. I'm not sure. But, they have been essentially relying on public data and information that RPD themselves have given them. And I believe that they've also looked at some best practices from across the country in President Obama's 21st Century Policing Blueprint. So that's kind of their scope. They have not done, community engagement sessions. They have not interviewed, civilians in Rochester. That's their kind of narrow scope for their work. And again, the heavy amount of data sharing apparently that they're doing with the RPD. So again, all of their recommendations are tentative, but I think it's important that, this board have a sense of where WilmerHale's looking to go with some of their recommendations. So I just want to outline where they seem to be right now. There seems to be a question about duty to intervene, whether or not that's something the RPD actually has, or if it's something the RPD needs to implement. There was a little back and forth today in the meeting. It didn't quite make it clear. But that's something that they definitely think is a best practice, to have a duty to intervene against officers who are breaking the rules. To have a more explicit policy on de-escalation, there seems to be the idea that in practice, RPD officers are being trained correctly. It's just a matter of making the policies more explicit. A push for using body-worn cameras during the use of the execution of search warrants, making sure that that's actually happening. Reforming our technology, not just policy, but technology, to allow body-worn camera data to be on demand. Apparently, the only way that the primary way that body-worn camera footage gets examined is if someone asks for it. So there's not a process of regularly reviewing body-worn camera footage. It's just kind of asking for it. And then WilmerHale will be pushing for a co-responder first responder model. So rather than having non-police first responders, to have a first responder with police, have a social worker with police and going out to calls. So the police presence is always there. That sounds like, again, these are initial thoughts from WilmerHale, where they're thinking of going, but nothing certain quite yet. And so I'll stop there with the WilmerHale. I'm happy to give more background on that conversation with WilmerHale. Any questions anyone has?
Yeah, I have a few questions.
Yeah.
So when we talked about a couple of things, you said they want more explicit policy on de-escalation. And then you talked about the body-worn cameras during search warrants. So that's basically, I'm interpreting that as outside of the search warrants, they won't be wearing them.
No,
can you go ahead?
I can clarify that. I think what they mean is that the rules are supposed to say that body-worn camera footage, in general, the policy is you got to have the camera on. And I think what they want to make sure is that during the execution of search warrants, that general rule applies.
Okay. So it's still left up to interpretation if the language in there doesn't explicitly say that they need to be on at all times.
Yeah. What I'll say is it's unclear. The presentation today, because they didn't have concrete recommendations, they were mostly shooting ideas. I told them this. I need to see concrete things because there's so many questions that have to be answered on this. But I think I think it was important to see where they're thinking of going, so we have a sense of where they may end up. Where they may end up on this stuff.
So a couple other things. Now you said that their scope is the use of force, the body-worn camera de-escalation. So I guess I'm just wondering, I know that RPD has been changing some policies already. So I'm wondering what set WilmerHale are reviewing. Are they reviewing the older policies, the current policies? Like what are they reviewing? Do we know?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's a little, because things seem to be changing. Like, for example, that I'm going to share my screen again. See how there's a question mark about the duty to intervene? During today's meeting, I think there was a little, there was a proposal, there was the idea that WilmerHale will be recommending a duty to intervene, but then there was pushback from the police department that we already have that because that's a new part of the policy. So I think that I think because there's change within RPD, I'm not sure, how totally synchronized WilmerHale is. I would hope that by the end, it's recommendations to what the current policies are.
So I guess that just begs another question. So if we're saying that we're also evaluating that their wheelhouse is use of force and de-escalation, and so they should be looking at protests, right? They should also be looking at the policies around protests, correct or no?
I don't know. I do not know how their specific instructions from the city have narrowed the scope of their work.
Okay, thank you.
And I will just say is that I requested a meeting with WilmerHale. I said two things. I told them two things. I said, first, I'd like to hear more about what you found, your process for figuring things out. I'd like to personally hear that. And I think my board has a lot of questions that they'd like to ask. And so if we could have that happen, that would be great. So I sent that request to WilmerHale, and I hope that, I know certainly they're going to be talking to us in one way or another. My hope is that you all would get the chance to ask them some questions.
When did you send that request, Connor?
Today, immediately after the meeting. Immediately after the meeting with them.
Okay, cool.
Connor, during the meeting, did they say at all when they would have when and if they will have their recommendations?
Yes.
Like, did they provide a timeline or deadline or?
Yes, and I'm going to answer that question in our next session when I go back to because all of the timelines got revised today because of this meeting, and I'll explain why in just a second. Any other questions that don't have to do with the timeline? Okay. So because of WilmerHale's presentation today, the working group timeline got changed. Whoops. So tomorrow's retreat, remember, so there was supposed to be a retreat starting tomorrow. It's going to be a 4-hour retreat where all of the participants in the working group got together, looked at the recommendations, and by the end of the retreat came up with a draft reform plan. right? That was the plan. But because Wilmer Hale doesn't have recommendations to bring to the table, Vice President Lightfoot, Doreen Kirkmeyer, I agreed that it didn't make any sense to have the retreat if Wilmer Hale's recommendations weren't there to be examined. So, the city publicly clarified to the Democrat and Chronicle that the retreat will not be public to, quote, allow for honest discussions. Just so that the community knows, that's the word out from the city. Wilmer Hale says that they are going to meet with both PAB and UCLM before that retreat to go over their recommendations and their process. Again, I don't know how that meeting will be, the details of that meeting. My hope is that it will be a public one, or at least one where all you can attend. So Wilmer Hale is planning on getting its recommendations to the working group at least 24 hours before that retreat on January 29th. My hope that, there was some thought that they'd be able to get it earlier that week. So not, the retreat's on a Friday. So the hope is we can get those recommendations a little beforehand. So to answer your question, Ida, we're not entirely sure, but the hope is before the retreat. That's the idea. And so it's possible that, 48 hours before the retreat, we may not know RPD's recommendations or Wilmer Hale's. That's the reality of this. And my hope is for us personally to have a revised set of recommendations approved of next Thursday, so that we can show the community that we have responded to the feedback we've received. My hope is to have those revised recommendations circulated to all of you earlier in the week, so you have a chance to look them through. I'm going to keep them brief. We're not going to do we had an 89-page document. We're not going to have anything close to that. We're going to have a separate document that says, here are the revisions, here are the big key points. That's it. I want to make this very simple and straightforward. We've done so much work on this already, and we have lots of work we have left to do, especially on the oversight hearings. But before I get to that, did anyone have questions about this timeline before we move on to the next phase?
I don't have a question, but I have a comment. I hope they use tomorrow's retreat time to work on their recommendations.
I have a comment also, right, which is to say, Wilmer Hale has all these resources. RASC has this huge budget, and under our wonderful leadership of Chair Wilson and Co-Chair McIntosh and our fabulous executive director, we actually got it done. So, and have done data-based and really detailed work that doesn't seem to be happening elsewhere. So I just feel like I would like the public to be aware of that.
Yeah. And I'll say, I'm very thankful that UCLM released its recommendations because it gives us time to think and talk together. I do think that, and we don't have to decide this tonight, I do think that the board should think about what strategy it wants to, what marching orders you want to give me going into this retreat. I am not sure. The mayor gave some very useful feedback. she said at the last meeting, she wasn't at today's meeting, but she was at the last Monday meeting, and she said, it looks like, we agree, I agree with so much of what the PAB is saying. I agree with so much of what USCLM is saying. So I think it's going to be, easy to reconcile these things. It's just going to be having, legal advice to say what doesn't work. And then, RPD saying what's not feasible. So that seems to be the process, is that, there will be consensus, and then the things that there isn't consensus on because RPD says it's not feasible, or because there's a legal barrier to implementation, that won't be a part of the process. That won't be part of the plan, or the agreed upon part of the plan. It might be in an appendix or something, or a different part of the plan, but not in the center that everyone agrees on. So that's
one more question about this. So is presumably Councilmember Lightfoot is there representing city council, yes? Or is in other words, is he presenting any proposal for the city itself?
Councilmember Melendez also attends many of these meetings, and I believe they've described their role as liaison, just having an eye on the process rather than being a participant in the process, because city council is going to have to review the plan and potentially revise or whatever on its own.
And I guess my follow-up question. So if they're extending deadlines, does that mean that we or the city will owe them any additional funds? Or, is there any additional cost that's incurred because they're pushing this deadline back? I mean, because, as Rabbi said, this has really been already $1 million project between Race and WilmerHale.
No, as I understand it, there is no additional funding. What I will say is that how do I say this? WilmerHale's work is not just tied to the executive order. WilmerHale will continue to work for the city after the executive order process. So WilmerHale's timeline is not necessarily tied to the executive order.
Okay, but still in that first phase of payment that was voted on.
That's right.
Okay.
Still in that first phase of payment. That's right.
Okay.
Okay, without any other questions about the timeline, I just want to briefly talk, oversight hearings. So, I think as we talked last time, it was great to, think about our resources that, the working group stuff would take up a lot of our time over the last week. So there hasn't been a ton of progress on the oversight hearings, except for the following. I've been doing a lot of research about how to get this done in the right way. I want to actually thank Stephanie Prince for a very helpful conversation about how to make sure we do this right. Because I think it's worth saying now and throughout the process that oversight hearings are different from disciplinary hearings, and that in an oversight hearing, we will not be doing any of the things that we cannot do under a court order. We will not be investigating individual officer wrongdoing, looking to hold individual officers accountable. We are instead doing exercising our still available powers to review and recommend policies to the RPD. And reviewing RPD policies means holding oversight hearings and asking hard questions. So, I did, right after our meeting last week, I reached out to Chief Harriet Sullivan, asking to nail down a time for her and command staff to attend. She looped in her scheduler, said, the 4th may work. Let's figure it out. So tentatively, we should have attendance from RPD. I'm going to follow up, and hopefully by tomorrow, we'll nail down if it's going to be the 4th or the 11th, those 2 dates we discussed before. We still should be on track to have that prep meeting on the 28th. We do not have a public meeting scheduled for that night. That would just be preparation time for us to figure out how to do this. But I'm just, I think that we are generally on track with that. The only exception is that now that the working group work has been pushed back, it makes things a little more challenging, with only the exception that, I think that I think it's a little bit up to the board to decide if you want to invest more time in the working group process now that we have additional time. I don't think we'll need to do, more gathering more feedback or public engagement around it necessarily. But if we do want to take more time around that to, speak with UCLM, try and, speak to WilmerHale more, we can do that. But the last piece of information I think is important, and this came out publicly with the DNC, is that, the police department is putting barriers up around the public safety building in anticipation of protests, and, it very well could be that there will be a decision from the grand jury, in days. no one can really know. But my point is that the urgency of dealing with protests is not going to go away. It's going to only increase.
Connor,
Yes.
I don't think it's Black Lives Matter that they're worried about.
It's true. We can't entirely speculate on what kind of protests that the police department is concerned about.
I think
right now,
they're looking at a bunch of white guys with guns.
I think that reviewing RPD protest policy, regardless of who's holding the protest, is important. What I will say, Bob, is that in the public meeting last week, RPD specifically discussed the role of that grand jury decision in their choice to revise protest policy.
And if you look at the statistics and data that's coming out from across the country, the police consistently over-prepare in quotation marks for left-wing demonstrations and under for right-wing ones. And I would add that in our region, at least so far, the white guys with guns have been in the burbs more than coming downtown in the city.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I agree that that's generally true, but they've had their noses rubbed in it lately. And you hate to make the same mistake twice.
I know I emailed all board members about.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Connor. One other thing that I wanted to say, and that is, I would, if there's any spare time, I would advocate using it for more preparation for our oversight hearing, because the oversight hearing is closer to what our actual job description is.
I don't know if folks have other thoughts on that specific question.
Good point. I'm also thinking, since there's been a lot of questions around implementation and enforcement, maybe spending some time to figure out an implementation strategy as well. Just a thought.
For the working group?
Yeah, because I think you said that there was a lot of questions on how is this going to be enforced. Maybe there's this law or these recommendations, but there's the wording or the language doesn't make it functional. It's kind of like perceive it how you want to perceive it. There's this lot of gray area in there. So maybe coming up with, some kind of implementation strategy, as how we're going to do the work. How do we get from the recommendation, get them off the paper and into action?
Right.
Just a thought. And I guess I just want one more thing. Is there a way we can, get copies? Maybe I can just download them off my computer, but I'm not going to have access to what RPD has already changed in terms of the policy. So if they're working on protest things now, how do I get access to what was up there already so I can review what was already in there and what's currently being changed?
Chair Wilson and I are meeting with Chief Harriet Sullivan on the 21st. That's next Thursday morning. Mm-hmm. Something that I'm going to say is that the PAB should have the same level of access and cooperation that Hale has received over the last 2 months. Access to data, access to officers to explain policies. And I wanted to give a quick update. I know last time we talked about an officer liaison. I have spoken to 2 officers. I am looking to speak to more because I do want to make sure that our liaison's right. I'm hoping to get a few more names in the next coming days. Ida, I think you and I spoke about ways to get those names. I'm following up on that. I do think it's important that we have more than one officer on the force that we're speaking to. I think that's very important. Someone who we know will have be able to speak to the chief quickly, someone who we know has a real good sense of the rank and file, someone who has a sense of what diverse officers are feeling on the force. I think it's very important for us to have all those things, but I think the most important thing is to have someone at the top that we can be immediately speaking to regularly. all the time. And be frank, Chief Harriet Sullivan should be that. We are at the top, but I do think that there's someone else there too. So I would like at this meeting with Chief Harriet Sullivan next Thursday to be able to request to nail down who that liaison is going to be, and then make clear that the PAB, needs to have the data. We need to have all the data that WilmerHale's getting, and then we need to have the same processes for getting data and openness that WilmerHale has gotten as well. So that's the usefulness of the WilmerHale process, is that, there's a framework that the PAB absolutely should be adopting.
I would say, Connor, that if you're not talking to some sergeants, that you're missing some important information.
I think that's really, and remember,
I think top officers are not the reliable source.
Right. Anything else about the oversight hearing process? Any questions about anything at all? This is kind of the end of the meeting. Otherwise, so if anyone has any questions about anything at all.
I have a question. Will it be yourself and will it be yourself and Chair Wilson that'll be attending the meeting on next Thursday?
It's a meeting in the morning. I am happy to have anyone on this board who is free to come attend that meeting with me.
All right.
And I will obviously ask, make sure that the chief understands that, but I think it's entirely appropriate for board members beyond Chair Wilson to be at that meeting.
All right. I just wanted to make sure that we had, as a board, we have things that even if we don't, other board members don't show up, that we want you guys to discuss in that meeting, because I think it's really important as far as the changes being made, what Dr. McIntosh said. Yeah, they're making changes, but we want to know what change, not only the new changes, but we want to know what were the policies prior to the changes. So just kind of seeing how we can kind of get that information, because we know they're already in the process.
This is sort of a different topic. I'm still back on the retreat, on the transparency issue. I feel like part of our job really is to be advocates for transparency wherever we go. And I'm really disturbed at this idea, first of all, that somehow being public means you can't be honest. Wait, isn't that sort of the opposite of what it should be? Anyway, and also that I think the public, our community, has a right to know, as not only what people have proposed, but what they're willing to agree to and not agree to. And that even if the retreat itself isn't streamed or whatever, that there has to be some way of reporting back about how different groups are perceiving policing and community safety and the commitments they're willing to make. So I just want to sort of put that out there.
It's a great point. I was thinking that as well.
Same here. I was thinking that as well. I just I know we kind of moved on from it, but it did kind of bother me when it was said, because it was just thrown out there. But I was thinking the same thing, that's pretty bold.
But it seems to really be a pattern, a pattern of, not being, even with the policies changing and us not knowing about it, seems to be a constant pattern of not being transparent, which is why we're here.
It'll be interesting to know what has caused the delay, right? Because we don't know. Maybe they did have access to stuff, but it wasn't right away or whatever. I don't know what the process may have been for them. But if this is the first phase of their payment and they have other things that they're doing with the city, hey, I would drag my feet too.
And Ida, I don't know if it's clear that they knew about the date of the retreat.
Oh, well, that's another thing, right? That's a whole nother matter, because you have several groups working on one thing. You got to make sure that communication is clear and that people understand what they're doing. So yep. Even that is unacceptable as well.
I agree.
I'll just throw my hat in on top of all that. I'm not going to say anything that hasn't been said, but to voice, it just seems really an insult to the public and to the taxpayers and to the people who are suffering on a daily basis and looking to their government, looking to their leaders to aggressively and proactively make changes to address these things, to come out and say, look, we just went through a summer of hell because of complete confusion around transparency and honesty from our government officials, especially here locally. It's not something that happened in another city. It's not just Breonna Taylor. It's not just George Floyd. It's here in our city. And to see them dragging their feet rather than being ahead of schedule on this, and to realize how urgent that is morally and I think politically reprehensible. And I hope that the fact that UCLM and the PAB have more than demonstrated the ability to collect the data, to be on time, and to respect their constituencies' needs will inspire the other agencies and folks to get off their you-know-what and get on the ball.
I wholeheartedly agree that not only are we the leaders in this, and we're showing them how to do it, but I think that we also ought to be the ones who are persistent about transparency. We mention it every time we see us, everything, it's at the bottom of every note. Transparency, transparency, transparency. So that others will know that that's what's expected. We're not going away. We're not going to stop asking. We're going to stay in your face with this, but that the public also knows that we're advocating for transparency for them. And that we're doing all we can. Be patient with us as we continue to draw the information and feed it to you. And emphasize, now that you've gotten the information, we're giving you what we have. We need your feedback to make this better. We're not a perfect board. We want to do what the community needs, but we can't do that if they're not feeding in. So far, they've been really good and gracious, but what I've noticed that what seems to happen is when something starts off, then yes, oh yeah, this is something new, but the more the process goes along, people's enthusiasm about it tends to drop off a bit. So we have to always keep the drum beating for this process, for transparency, and for our relevance. What you think, Stephanie?
And I also wanted to echo that. I think individuals' enthusiasm may also drop off because, as we start getting to a process, then, it's like the wool is thrown over your eyes. Like, here we have, Wilmer Hale coming in to do this work and do recommendations, and now this task force to do the same work that we were tasked to do, or, the police. So we have these different agencies that are supposed to be doing this work to look at these policies, but then all of a sudden the policies are being changed behind the back and no one's knowing about that. So you're feeling like you're in a system that you're trying to make change. You want good results from the system, but yet you still feel like it's undermining you. It's undermining the work that we do. It's undermining the citizens in the community. So that's, to me, why also someone may lose their enthusiasm, because they feel like no matter what they do, the system's going to stay the same. Just my 2 cents.
Yes, but we know the devil we're dancing with. We know that they don't want to give up. And that's just too bad, because we're going to keep asking and keep coming. Definitely going to do that.
And all I'll say, I think that, the Democrat Chronicle pointed out this week, but, the governor's guidance for the executive order work says that all planning and deliberation meetings have to be public. That's the legal guidance from the state. So, I'll just, that's the facts. So I think that we do have some time. Thankfully, we do have some time to think about how we want to approach that meeting. And so I hope that folks maybe in the next week can think about, again, marching orders for myself. And I think Chair Wilson will also be in that meeting. We could also ask if other board members would like to show up to that meeting. But what I'll say, Arlene, to your point about enthusiasm, in the last week, the number of people who've reached out about oversight hearings, saying how excited they are to finally get answers from the RPD, a lot of people have been very, very enthusiastic about that. And I think that gets to Bob's point about, this being some very important work that only we can do. Only we can do. And so I couldn't be more excited to get there. So with that, any additional questions? Chair Wilson, I know you hopped in. I hope you're okay. Everything's all right?
Yeah, sorry, folks. The meeting I was in ran longer than expected. So no, I'm just listening. And I mean, we've been talking about this for a while, so I'm not going to add much else to this conversation. I think this conversation is pretty much saying everything I need to say. So.
I wanted to suggest that with respect to the oversight business, that if we're going to have any consultants, that we get them up front, make them the first people that we interact with, so that by the time we get to actually doing oversight, we've got some information under our belts. Yes. What I will say too, just to make clear, this first hearing, asking questions from the chief, having them present their plan and asking, initial set of questions, that's just the first information gathering phase. I'm saying that should be second, not first. Okay. That's my experience as a reviewer. Well, I want to make clear what I mean is it's the first phase of the hearings. So my plan is to get all of you folks information from the RPD beforehand to review and asking them questions first, asking for written answers to questions first, so that you folks have a chance to review some things, not going in blind.
Sounds good.
Okay.
So Connor, I think your action items are to send the board members those meeting dates that you mentioned. For
Wilmer Hale?
One for Wilmer Hale, and you said something about the chief, a meeting with her or something?
Chair Wilson, we discussed having other board members attend our meeting on the 21st with the chief. Okay, so meeting with chief, okay. And then the Wilmer Hale date, that I will say, just given our schedule, if there's a meeting with Wilmer Hale, we'd have to decide, if we want to bump, I think it might be best to have that meeting maybe separate from our normal board meetings, simply because we're already calendared out. So, it might be another thing, Danielle, where it's whoever can come can come. Okay. All right. Anything else on the action items, Dr. McIntosh?
No. Executive Director Reynolds.
Anything else from anyone else? Oh, we can get done before 8 o'clock. Watch out. It'll happen.
All right. So if nobody has any questions or concerns, I guess I just need a motion. Or I can let you do it, Shani, if you want.
Oh, no, I will make a motion to end this meeting tonight.
Okay. All in favor? Let me see your hands. Anyone opposed? Okay. Anybody abstain? All right. Motion carries.